I've always been very interested in how people are affected by the places around them, by their physical surroundings. That was the first book on the subject I wrote, The Experience of Place. After school, I somehow landed at the New Yorker magazine as a writer, and so I was sort of hired to explore this. I began to just sort of, I was equally interested in countrysides, and realized that we all have in us this other way of responding to places, where we're deeply drinking in all the sights and sounds and tastes and smells, and that we use this to construct our sense of who we are. It changes our sense not only of where we are when we change places, but of who we are. We have this apparatus built into all of us, and yet it's the one that we get no instruction in school. That's what we all have, and it's what keeps us together and forms wonderful communities like Chestertown and wonderful places like the Delmarva Peninsula. So I got very interested in people like Benton Mackay, who was the father of the Appalachian Trail, and who said that the whole of he didn't want to just build a trail. He really wanted to do something for what he called the Appalachian domain, meaning the whole Appalachian countryside in between the cities of the East Coast and the cities of the Midwest. And he also had this idea that we needed city experiences because cities help grow parts of us, but we also needed connection to two other kinds of experiences. One was wild landscapes in the sort of John Muir Thoreau tradition, but ordinary sort of countryside, working countryside too, because that was where people were trying to live in harmony with the land. And that once we had all three of those things working for us, it was his proposition, something else began to percolate in our heads, which he called a planetary feeling, which we might call a sense of the amazingness and the vulnerability of the biosphere itself. But what he was saying was that 1 + 1 + 1, cities plus wilderness plus farmed areas, equals 4. Something new that would emerge, what he at one point called the gradually emerging human mind. And I think now it's not just something that could happen, but something we're beginning to realize we need to get better at, because the book I'm writing now, called 50 by 50, is about what I sometimes think of as the other environmental crisis. Not climate change, although climate change is part of it, but the fact that so many of the fellow creatures with which we share the biosphere could, because of our carelessness and inactions, wink out of existence. The science I'm going on at least, suggests that if we could somehow protect, and we're talking a combination of wildernesses, farming areas, cities, 50% of the landscape, we could hang on to at least 85% of the 10 million other species, whereas we're now up to about 15% protection, speaking overall. And that will only guarantee survival for maybe a quarter of the 10 million other species. So it's sort of an added plus calculation that they're saying 15% gives you a quarter, but 50% gives you 85%. So it's something that we could accomplish, and that's what I'm going around, running around, looking at all the people who seem to be inspired by the same idea. So it's what technically seems to be called a BHAG.
What?
A BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And that's a technical term invented by business consultants, called in to help companies trying to do long-range planning. Things that will take longer than 5 or 10 years to accomplish, but that can happen. our concept of a national park has always been you buy it up and you set it aside. But we've had a second tradition, which we don't know nearly as much about, of so-called green line parks, which means you identify an area as a very special area, but you don't expect it to all become public ownership. It's a partnership arrangement, and the Adirondacks are the most notable example. The British took that idea from us, and after World War II set up their first national park system. All green line parks. The Lake District, Broadmoor, Exmoor, all these astonishing landscapes, which have been settled landscapes in large measure for centuries. It's a much, settlement goes back a long way over there. Supplemented by a second tier of astonishing landscapes called areas of outstanding natural beauty, AONBs. Also green line parks. A prototype was developed and enacted in the southern New Jersey, the Pinelands of southern New Jersey, 1.1 million acres, set up as a partnership with the state of New Jersey and under a state-run agency, and also prodded by a Friends of movement, to which a wonderful man has devoted 30 years of his life to continued prodding, and it's been a remarkable success. It's an area of, it sits on a huge aquifer from which a lot of drinking water comes, but it also is an area not only of marshes and forests, but of cranberry bogs, blueberries. Every summer in New York, the best blueberries come from the Pinelands, and still sold by our fruit vendor at 9th Street and University Place. This was going to have been rolling out a sort of second generation of national parks based on a green line model, was going to have been the great environmental initiative of the second Jimmy Carter administration. Only there was no second Jimmy Carter administration. And the Pinelands stand and have stood the test of time, but nothing has followed in its wake, except for bits and pieces of the idea, like heritage areas or scenic byways. And it seemed to me, what would be the ideal pilot project, the ideal model, but the Delmarva Peninsula. So that's what I started talking about to some people in November, and got a nice positive response, and they invited me to come down, repeat performance, which is what I'm here for now. And also, if we're now thinking in terms of protecting not just us, but 8.5 million other species, it's in a context where we're being prodded by necessity to think beyond, in terms of what I call a larger here and a longer now.